Shalom, 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 everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back, man. Whew. Welcome back to Reading with Shilo. It's Shilo. I'm in here ready for the next edition to Reading with Shilo. Came out this garden. Clean this mud out from under my fingernails right quick. We're ready for the next 3 chapters of the narrative of life of Frederick Douglass. We're going to read chapter 5, 6, and chapter 7. Chapter 5, 6, and 7. Man. Mr. Frederick Douglass was telling us a lot about what life as a slave was like. But we're going to let him keep telling us. We're going to let him keep telling us and keep showing us, what slave life actually looked like. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, chapter 5. As to my own treatment while I lived in Colonel Lloyd's plantation, it was very similar to that of the other slave children. I was not old enough to work in the field, and there being little else than field work to do, I had a great deal of leisure time. The most I had to do was to drive up the cows at evening, keeping the fowls out of the garden, keep the front yard clean, and run of errands of my old master's daughter, Miss Lucretia Auld. The most of my leisure time I spent in helping Master Daniel Lloyd in finding his birds after he had shot them. My connection with Master Daniel was of some advantage to me. He became quite attached to me and was a sort of protector of me. He would not allow the older boys to impose upon me and would divide his cakes with me. I was seldom whipped by my old master and suffered little from anything else than hunger and cold. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In hottest summer and coldest winter, I was kept almost naked. No shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse towel linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. I must have perished with cold. But the coldest nights I used to steal a bag which was used to carry corn to the mill. I would crawl into this bag and there sleep on the cold, damp clay floor with my head in and feet out. Shit. My feet had been so cracked from the frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. We were not regularly allowed. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. I think that's what we call some mush. I didn't have that. That's what I think it is. I didn't have that. Some mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs, they would come to devour the mush. Some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and others with spoons. And none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. I was probably between 7 and 8 years old when I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. I left it with joy. I shall never forget the ecstasy with which I received the intelligence that my old master, Anthony, had determined to let me go to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Auld, brother to my old master's son-in-law, Captain Thomas Auld. I received this information about 3 days before my departure. There were 3 of the happiest days I ever enjoyed. I spent the most part of these 3 days. I spent the most part of these 3 days in the creek, washing off the plantation scurf and preparing myself for my departure. The pride of appearance which this would indicate was not my own. I spent the time in the washing, not so much because I wished to, but because Miss Lucretia had told me. I must get all the dead skin off my feet and knees before I, which I should not put on unless I got all the dirt off of me. The thought of owning a pair of trousers was great indeed. It was almost a sufficient motive, not only to make me take off what would be called the pig drovers, the manage, uh, what would be called by pig drovers the mange, but the skin itself. I went at in a good earnest. Man, I'm reading terrible today. I'm reading terrible today. I think I'm just tired. I went at it in good earnest, working for the first time with the hope of reward. The ties that ordinarily bind children to their homes were all suspended in my case. Not home to me. On parting from it, I could not feel that I was leaving anything which I could have enjoyed by staying. My mother was dead. My grandmother lived far off, so that I seldom saw her. I had two sisters and one brother, and they lived in the same house with me. But the early separation of us from our mother had well nigh blotted the fact of our relationship from our memories. I looked for home elsewhere, and was confident of finding none which I should relish less than the one which I was leaving. If, however, I find in my new home hardship, hunger, whipping, and nakedness, I had the consolation of any one of them by staying. Having already had more than the taste of them in the house of the old master, and having endured them there, I very naturally inferred my ability to endure them elsewhere, and especially at Baltimore. For I had something of a feeling about Baltimore that is expressed in the proverb that being hanged in England is preferable to dying a natural death in Ireland. I had the strongest desire to see Baltimore. Cousin Tom, though not fluent in speech, had inspired me that desire to by his eloquent description of the place. I could never put out anything out into the great house, no matter how beautiful or powerful. But they but that he had seen something at Baltimore far exceeding, both in beauty and strength, the object which I pointed out to him. Even the great house itself, with all its pictures, was far inferior to many buildings in Baltimore. So strong was my desire that I thought a gratification of it would fully compensate for whatever loss of comforts I should sustain by the exchange. I left without a regret and with the highest hopes of future happiness. We sailed out on the Miles River for Baltimore on the Saturday morning. I remember only the day of the week, for at that time I had no knowledge of the days of the month, nor the months of the year. On setting sail, I walked aft and gave to Colonel Lloyd's plantation what I hoped would be the last look. I then placed myself on the bows of the sloop and there spent the remainder of the day in looking ahead, interesting myself in what was in the distance rather than the things nearby or behind. In the afternoon of that day, we reached Annapolis, the capital of the state. We stopped but a few moments, so that I had no time to go on the shore. It was the first large town that I'd ever seen, and though it would look small compared with some of our New England factory villages, I thought it a wonderful place for its size, more imposing even than the great house farm. We arrived at Baltimore early on Sunday morning, landing at Smith's Wharf, not far from the Bowley's Wharf. We had on board the sloop a large flock of sheep, and after aiding a driver in driving them to the slaughterhouse of Mr. Curtis on Larding Slaughter's Hill, I was conducted by Rich, one of the hands belonging on board of the sloop, to my new home in Elysiana Street, near Mr. Gardner's shipyard in Fless Point. Mr. and Mrs. Auld were both at home and met me at the door with their little son Thomas to take care of whom I had been given. And here I saw what I had never seen before. It was a white face beaming with the most kindly emotions, and it was the face of my new mistress, Sophia Auld. I wish I could describe the rapture that flashed through my soul as I beheld it. It was the new and strange sight to me, brightening up my pathway with light and happiness. Little Thomas was told there was his Freddie. And I was told to take care of little Thomas. And thus I entered upon the duties of my new home with the most cheering prospect ahead. I looked upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting events of my life. It is possible and even quite probable that but for the mere circumstances of being removed from that plantation to Baltimore, I should have today, instead of being here seated by my own table, in the enjoyment of freedom and the happiness of home, writing this narrative, been confined in the galling chains of slavery. Going to live in Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all the subsequent prosperity I had ever regarded. I have ever regarded it as the first plain manifestation of that kind providence which has ever since attended me and marked my life with so many favors. I regarded the selection of myself as being somewhat remarkable. There were a number of slave children that might have been sent off to the plantation in Baltimore. There were those younger, those older, and those the same age. I was chosen from among them all and was first, last, and only choice. I may be deemed superstitious and even egotistical in regarding this event as a special interposition of divine providence in my favor, but I should be false to the earliest sentiments of my soul if I suppress the opinion. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than be false and incur my own abhorrence. From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of the deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace. And in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained the ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom. This good spirit was from God, and to him I offer thanksgiving and praise. What's up, Daddy? Chapter 6. Man, I'm reading terrible. My new mistress proved to be all she appeared when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and the finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself, and prior to her marriage, she had been dependent upon her own industry for her living. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business, she had been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My earlier instruction was all out of place. The crouching servility, usually so acceptable a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested toward her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling having seen her. Her face was made a heavenly smile, and her voice a tranquil music. But alas, this kind heart has but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye under the influence of slavery soon became red with rage. That voice made all of sweet accord change to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. I was about to say. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. All, she very kindly commenced to teach me ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words in 3 or 4 letters. Just as this point in my progress, Mr. All found out what was going on and at once forbade Miss All to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach the slave to read. To use his own words, further, he said, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an L. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now said he, if you teach that nigger, speaking of himself, how to read, there will be no keeping him. It will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontent and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation explaining dark and mysterious things, with which my youthful understanding has struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understand. Oh, man. I now understand what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I was least expecting it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instructions which, by the merest accident, I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very deciding manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. It gave me the best assurance that I might really or rely with the uttermost confidence on the results which he said would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, that I most desired. What he most loved, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought. And the argument which he so warmly urged against me learning to read only served to inspire me with the desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. I had resided but a short time in Baltimore before I observed the marked difference in the treatment of slaves from that which I had witnessed in the country. A city slave is almost a free man compared with the slave on the plantation. He is much better fed and clothed and enjoys privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation. There is a vestige of decency and sense of shame that does much to curb and check those outbreaks of atrocious cruelty so commonly enacted upon the plantation. He is a desperate slaveholder who will shock the humanity of his non-slave holding neighbors with the cries of his lacerated slave. Few are willing to incur the odium attaching to the reputation of being a cruel master, and above all things, they would not be known as giving a slave enough to eat. Every city slaveholder is anxious to have it known of him that he feeds his slaves well, and it is due to them to say that most of them do give their slaves enough to eat. They are, however, some painful expectations to this rule, or exceptions, to this rule. Directly opposite to us, the Philpott Street, lived Mr. Thomas Hamilton. He owned two slaves. Their names were Henrietta and Mary. Henrietta was about 22 years of age, and Mary was about 14. And of all the mangled and emaciated creatures I ever looked upon, these two were the most so. His heart must be harder than stone that could look upon these unmoved. The head, neck, and shoulders of Mary were literally cut to pieces. I have frequently felt her head and found it nearly covered with festering sores caused by the lashes of her cruel mistress. I do not know that her master ever whipped her, but I have been an eyewitness to the cruelty of Mrs. Hamilton. I used to be in Mr. Hamilton's house nearly every day, and Mrs. Hamilton used to sit in a large chair in the middle of the room with a heavy cow skin always by her side, and scarce an hour passed during the day but was marked by the blood of one of these slaves. The girl seldom passed her without a saying, "Move faster, you black git." Move. That sound like my mama. Bum! Bum, 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 bum. Ooh, it sound like my mama used to get me with that cow skin. We call it red. Take that, you black gip. Continue. If you don't move faster, I'll move you. Adding to the cruel lashing to which these slaves were subjected, they were kept nearly half starved. They seldom knew what it was to eat a full meal. I have seen Mary contending with the pigs for the offal throw into the streets. So much was Mary kicked and cut to pieces that she was oftener called pecked than by her name. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, however, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as human being was not only wrong but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, she was pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender-hearted became stone, and the lamb-like disposition grew way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practicing her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simple doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made up in a fury and snatch from me a newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. From this time, I was most narrowly watched. I bet. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book. Look at the things they suspect. I was surely, if I was in another room for any length of time, considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. The plan which I had adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the streets. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtaining the different times in the different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent on errands, I always took my book with me. And by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who in return would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I am strongly tempted to give the names of the 2 or 3 of those little boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear them, but prudence forbids. Not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them. For it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. In this Christian country. It was enough to say of the dear little fellows that they lived on Philpott Street, very near Durgan and Bailey shipyard. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them, I wished I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. I wished I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. You will be free as soon as you are 21, but I am a slave for life. Have not I as good a right to be free as you have? These words used to trouble them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator. Every opportunity I got, I used to read this book. Among much of other interesting matter, I found it in a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them. when the slave was retaken the third time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had things which had desired things which had the desired though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of his master. In the same book, I met with one of the Sheridan's mighty speeches on and in behalf of the Catholic emancipation. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. The reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. But while they relieved me of one difficulty, they brought on another even more painful, that the one of which I was relieved. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest even slavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stole us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. And as I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come, to torment and sting my soul to utterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without a remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump from freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound, and seen in everything. It was ever present to torment me with the sense of its wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it. I felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. I often found myself regretting my own existence and wishing myself dead. And but for the hope of being free, I had no doubt but that I should have killed myself or done something for which I should have been killed. While in this state of mind, I was eager to hear anyone speak of slavery. I was a ready listener. Every little while, I could hear something about the abolitionists. It was some time before I found what the word meant. It was always used in such connections as to make it interesting, an interesting word to me. If a slave ran away and succeeded in getting clear, or if a slave killed his master, set fire to a barn, or did anything very wrong in the mind of the slaveholder, it was spoken of as the fruits of the abolition. Hearing the word in this connection very often, I set about learning what it meant. The dictionary afforded me little or no help. I found it was the act of abolishing, but then I did not know what was to be abolished. Here I was perplexed. I did not dare to ask one about its meaning, for I was satisfied that it was something that wanted me that it was something they wanted me to know very little about. After a patient waiting, I got one of our city papers containing an account of the numbers of petitions for the North, praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and of the slave trade between the states. From this time, I understood the word abolition and abolitionists and always drew near when the words were spoken, expecting to hear something of importance to myself and fellow slaves. The light broke in upon me by degrees. I went one day down into the wharf with Mr. Waters, and seeing two Irishmen uploading a skew of stones, I went unasked and helped them. When we had finished, one of them came to me and asked me if I were a slave, and I told him I was. He asked, "Are you a slave for life?" I told him that I was. The good Irishman seemed to be deeply affected by the statement. He said to the other that it was a pity so fine a little fellow as myself should be a slave for life. He said it was a shame to hold me. They both advised me to run away to the north. That I thought he was already in the north. I thought Baltimore is the north. They both advised me to run away to the north, that I should find friends there, and that I should be free. I pretended not to be interested in what they said and treated them as if I did not understand them, for I feared they might be treacherous. White men have been known to encourage slaves to escape and then to get the reward, catch them, and return them to their masters. I was afraid that these seemingly good men might use me so. But I nevertheless remembered their advice, and from that time I resolved to run away. I looked forward to a time in which it would be safe for me to escape. I was too young to think of doing so immediately. Besides, I wished to learn how to write, as I might have occasion to write my own paths. I consoled myself with the hope that I should one day find a good chance. Uh, Meanwhile, I would learn to write. The idea as to how I might learn to write was suggested to me by being in Durgan on Bailey's shipyard. Frequently seeing the ship carpenters, after hewing and getting a piece of timber ready for use, write on the timber the name of the part of the ship for which it was intended. When a piece of timber was intended for the larboard side, excuse me, it would be marked thus L. When the piece was for the starboard side, it would be marked thus S, and a piece for the larboard side forward would be marked thus LF. When a piece for the starboard side forward, it would be marked thus SF. For larboard side aft, it would be marked thus LA, and for starboard aft, it would be marked thus SA. I soon learned the names of these letters, and for what they were intended when placed upon a piece of timber in the shipyard. I immediately commenced copying them, and in a short time was able to make the four letters named. After that, when I met with any boy who I knew could write, I would tell him I could write as well as he. The next word would be, "I don't believe you. Let me see you try." I would then make the letters which I had been so fortunate as to learn, and ask him to beat that. In this way, I got a good many lessons in writing. Man, there you go. Which it is quite possible I should never have gotten in any other way. During this time, my copybook was a board fence, brick wall, the pavement. My pen and ink was a lump of chalk. With these, I learned mainly how to write and then commenced and continued copying the italics in Webster's spelling book until I could make them all without looking on the book. Man. By this time, my little master Thomas had gone to school and learned how to write, and had written over a number of copybooks. These had been brought home and shown to some of our neighbors, and they laid aside. My mistress used to go to class meetings at the Wilkes Street Meeting House every Monday afternoon and leave me to care for the house. When left thus, I used to spend the time in writing in spaces left in Mr. Thomas's copybook, copying what he had written, and I continued to do this until I could write a hand very similar to that of Master Thomas. Thus, after a long, tedious effort for years, I finally succeeded in learning how to write. Oh man, that was that, man. That was chapter 5, 6, and 7. I'm tired. Digging up that yard, boy, I'm tired. 5, 6, and 7 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, man. A Dover Thrift Edition. Frederick trying to move up in life, man. He trying to learn to read and write. He done did that. Sneakily. Using the tricks and trades. He did what he had to do to learn how to read and write. He said he used pavements and chalk. Charcoal as his chalk. Pavements and fences to write on. Man, oh man. Well, with a little bit of persistence, man, anything can happen. Anything. But that's what it is, man. I appreciate everybody who stuck with me today. Man, I'm tired, man. I'm tired. I started off reading bad, ended off better. But we'll keep going. We'll keep going. Till next time, man. Shalom. Shalom out, man. Shalom out.